Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Senator Wyden. I just want to say this is an example of, I think, what we do best here in Oregon, taking a problem that has jurisdictions both at the state level and at the federal level, and working together to try to find a solution that, that will work for all of us. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the Senate Environment and Energy Committee and our senior United States Senator, Ron Wyden.
Oh, thank you, Governor. And I don't want to make this a bouquet tossing contest, but suffice it to say that all sensible natural resources policy is going to require an effective federal-state partnership, and the Oregon congressional delegation could not have a better partner in this cause than John Kitzhaber. So let's have a little Oregon shout out for him. So look for a minute at the leaders behind us. They're from the forest products sector, they're from the environmental community, they're distinguished scientists, guardians of clean water, recreation advocates, and talented local officials. And all of us are here with a straightforward message. We have found a way to create good-paying jobs in rural Oregon and protect our natural treasures. And we did it by rejecting radical policies on both ends of the spectrum and chose instead to work to build a new and enduring foundation for the rural Oregon economy. And first and foremost, this is a jobs bill. This legislation ends the stop everything bureaucratic approach that beats even the most responsible timber projects into submission. And at the same time, it acknowledges that the days of producing nearly 1 billion board foot cut are not coming back. This approach substantially increases the timber that goes to our mills, and it creates certainty. Certainty for our working families, certainty for our counties, certainly for every employer who we'd like to see invest in the future of our timber communities. By doubling the harvest over the average of the last 10 years, these communities will be able to save the jobs they have now and create more, assuring future decades of reliable harvests that average between 300 and 350 million board feet can give employers confidence that they can grow their business and provide more good-paying jobs. Now, we worked with the best scientists in the Northwest to make these harvests as ecologically friendly as we possibly could. And we listened to the conservation groups who said we need ironclad protections for clean drinking water and Oregon's salmon and unique wildlife. And the most important environmental win in this bill is that it provides the first ever legislative protection for old growth on the O&C lands. And we believe this means more jobs and more economic opportunity for fallers and choker setters in the woods, for millwrights and sawyers making lumber for our houses, and work for plumbers and hardware stores and other small businesses needed to meet the demand for more goods and services in rural Oregon. Most importantly, these are full-time, good-paying jobs that offer an alternative to the grinding underemployment which has hit rural Oregon so hard in recent years. Without a new plan, the amount of timber coming off the O&C lands is going to continue to drop. Jobs are going to be lost, and our communities are going to suffer under the current policies. At the same time, the chances of getting federal approval for clear cuts across the landscape, producing enough timber to fund the counties on their own, are no more likely than opening up our national parks for oil drilling and coal mining. It would take around 700 to 800 million board feet or more to fully replace the funding our counties currently get from secure rural schools. Trying that kind of approach would take Oregon back to the brawls of the 1990s. It cannot pass the Congress. It doesn't get our rural counties any closer to a solution. And that's why I'm focused on a solution that can actually become law. For years at scores of rural town hall meetings, I've said I'm committed to getting people back to work in the woods, providing timber payments, and an economic safety net for the communities. Now, those of us here today are focused on getting people back to work in the woods. But make no mistake about it, I am also going to miss no opportunity to secure the timber safety net. And I was able to do it once again a few weeks ago with the helium bill that will produce checks for rural Oregon here in a few weeks. I'm seeking long-term funding for timber payments, and I want it understood that today is about legislation that can get Oregonians back to work in our rural communities, but we're also going to continue to focus on getting rural communities off that kind of roller coaster as it relates to the safety net. This legislation can secure the future of our forests and communities, not just for a few years, but for decades. First, the bill sets aside half of the O&C land for forestry and the other half for conservation. So there's no question about where sustainable timber harvests are as a priority. It bans the harvest of old growth on all O&C lands. Our all-star scientists, we've kind of got the NBA all-star of science here. Oregon State's Norm Johnson, the University of Washington's Jerry Franklin, have downloaded their knowledge and expertise into this bill. With their help, we put an end to the practice of lawyers instead of foresters deciding which trees to cut and when. Exempting these lands from the federal environmental rules is dead on arrival in this Congress and unacceptable to the President. Even when my Republican colleagues controlled both houses of the Congress and the White House, they were unable to make any meaningful changes to the management or production from O&C lands. Focusing on approaches that cannot become law simply take Oregon further away from a long-term solution and dangerously close to the point where O&C timber output won't even be able to support the small number of mills that we have left. This legislation upholds the Endangered Species Act and other bedrock environmental laws. And I want to be clear on that. It also puts the agencies on a tight and achievable timeline to address the environmental questions, and it prevents outside groups who have not participated in the process from parachuting in to throw up last-second roadblocks. Under today's rules, every single timber sale, every single one, is subject to an individual environmental review, each one of which could give rise to a new 6-year delay. Under my bill, there will be only one environmental impact statement for all the wet forests and one environmental impact statement for all of the dry forests. Under today's rules, any environmental group can come in months or years after a successful collaborative process that has been working to put together a timber sale and derail the entire effort with a threat to appeal. Under my legislation, if you didn't engage in good faith and raise the issues early on, you do not have a right to appeal. So this is a philosophy for natural resources that makes it clear that forest policy ought to be dictated by science and not lawyers. We've worked, in addition, with one of our region's foremost water resource experts, Dr. Gordon Reeves, to establish the first ever legislative protections for O&C streams. And we spoke at length with the people responsible for bringing clean water to communities near O&C forests, and a number of them are here today as well. As a result, this bill establishes special additional protections for key watersheds that provide clean drinking water for Oregon's communities. Finally, protecting Oregon's treasures has always been a guiding principle for my time in public service. So I'm proud to be able to announce this morning that this bill creates 87,000 acres of wilderness and protects 165 miles of wild and scenic rivers. It's going to permanently conserve nearly 1 million acres of O&C lands, which would constitute the single biggest increase in Oregon's conservation lands in decades. There are also special areas protected for recreation, which is an increasingly important part of our rural economies. And I want it understood that I think this legislation is going to ensure that recreation is a genuine economic engine for Oregon's rural communities for decades to come. Finally, folks are asking about the money that goes to the counties. And there's a little bit of an irony that some of the county commissioners who are asking about the money are the ones who said money doesn't matter. They wanted jobs in the woods. So this is a jobs bill. This is about getting people back to work in the woods. And as I've already indicated, I think our agenda ought to be about getting folks back to work in the private sector, in the forest products industry, and making sure that we have a safety net. I have said all along that logging by itself, and not even this bill by itself, is going to solve all of the funding issues for O&C counties. The governor did an excellent report. It makes that clear that the only way to raise that kind of money is to return to unsustainable harvest levels and waive the environmental laws. So I've already begun to work on a long-term replacement for the county payments program that will permanently fund the programs that rural communities depend on. And I think there's an opportunity to stitch together a new coalition where you have people, where there are federal lands and federal waters coming together, and I think communities that produce energy and minerals and timber and other resources that benefit the entire country, they ought to be fairly compensated for the impacts of the work. So I'm going to close with another thank you to Governor Kitzhaber. Governor Kitzhaber was the one who really laid the groundwork for this debate by bringing together folks at the state level. And I also want to understood that I'm going to be working very closely with the other members of the Oregon congressional delegation. We all want the same thing. We want more jobs for rural Oregon, and we want some relief for these rural communities that are walking on an economic tightrope every single day. They have been hit by a wrecking ball over the last decade and a half, and the Oregon congressional delegation is united in terms of coming together around key principles that focus on jobs and getting people back to work in the woods. The gridlock that we've had about the timber wars, over the timber wars, has taken a toll on the well-being of our rural communities and the results and the health of our forest. It has resulted in both sides advocating policies that are not supported by sound science. And so we've had people throwing stones back and forth, and while all those stones are hurling about, in the air, rural Oregon keeps losing timber jobs and our mills keep struggling to survive. So in place of management based on science, we've had, lawyers, depending on how forests ought to be managed, and that is what we are going to change with this legislation. Every tough natural resources approach in Oregon, the governor and I have talked about it, and Governor, I think your talented resources staff, Richard, is floating about here. He's done great work on this and also on the Klamath. We've come to feel that the tough natural resources issues for Oregon basically come down to this. Nobody gets everything they want. Nobody gets everything they believe they deserve. The question is, can we get what Oregon needs? And with the partners that are up here today, I believe Oregonians can agree on a bill that gets folks in O&C country what they need. That's why we're here today. I have managed to work out with all these folks because they have so much expertise in forestry that you all in the press can feel free to give me any easy softball questions, anything difficult, please feel free to give to my compatriots here. But the scientists have done wonderful work on these maps. This is groundbreaking science. And throughout this bill, there are a bunch of new things. You know, the concept of forest, emphasis areas and conservation areas. These are fresh approaches. So kidding aside, we got a lot of talent here. Let's go to your questions. And good, even better.
Thank you, Senator. I have just a couple of brief comments, having spent several months with a lot of the people behind here about a year ago trying to find a path forward. I think this is a very significant day, and I appreciate Senator Wyden and his strong leadership in trying to move this ball forward. I think it would be easy to shy away from taking on an issue of this magnitude, but I think we should be very grateful that the Senator is willing to take a stand. We're well served by his willingness to do this, as by the willingness of Congressman DeFazio and Schrader and Walden. I think our entire delegation is united around trying to find a solution here. I'm very pleased that the bill that the Senator has drafted does include and improve on many of the recommendations that we arrived at in our own work group. Obviously, the need to protect drinking water, old growth, key watersheds, threatened endangered species habitat, and wilderness, and also requiring that the forests, that ecologic forestry be implemented in a manner that increases the timber supply in our rural communities and the jobs that depend on them, but also seeks to modernize our environmental laws in a way that locks in the conservation gains that the Senator described, but also ensures communities and businesses that they will have an ecologically based supply of timber that they can count on in the future. This bill, as well as the House-passed bill that was drafted by Congressman DeFazio and Walden and Schrader, are two different approaches to solving the O&C issue, but I think the principles are exactly the same. And in fact, if you sort of take a 60,000-foot view, I think we all agree on the key elements that are necessary to find a solution. And I believe that with these two bills that we are going to be able to build a bridge and find a compromise that works for all Oregonians and hopefully is signed by the President in 2014. And if we do that, if we succeeded, I'm prepared to seek funding for voluntary conservation measures on the private checkerboard lands, and also to work with the legislature and the O&C counties to ensure that there are adequate financial resources to provide those basic services that those counties depend on. The chairman has agreed to make this bill a priority bill and to work with me and the congressional delegation to put something together that can pass both houses of Congress and be signed by the President in 2014. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I stand ready to work with you and assist you in any way that I can.
After all these years, it's become chairman and governor as opposed to John and Ron.
Well, there's a reason for that, because we are being followed by Norm and Jerry. So John and Ron is just too much. So we're going to hear from Dr. Norm Johnson and Dr. Jerry Franklin, who've done, as you know, a great deal of work on this over the years. So let me have them come up, and then, as the Senator says, we'll be happy to answer your questions.
I think I'm Norm Johnson. And
you can stand right up there. Norm Johnson.
I think we need the local first.
Yeah. I'm Norm Johnson. I'm a prof at the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. And we've been working for a fairly a long time, 3 or 4 years, on trying to develop ecological forestry approaches to managing the O&C lands, first at the request of Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar. And we're delighted that the Senator was interested in these approaches, that the legislation reflects them, and it is a different way for managing these lands. Jerry Franklin and I said from the beginning in our efforts, we want to find approaches to managing these forests that both provide simultaneously ecological benefits and economic benefits. Provide them together. And we've put forth ideas that we think helps do that. In addition, as part of this effort, of course, with the importance of water and fish to Oregonians, we involved Gordy Reeves right here from the P&W station, who's developed a number of creative ideas on how to protect these vital resources while still allowing forestry to proceed, especially ecological forestry. So as the senator said, there are a lot of ideas in this bill that are fairly new. We have a number of pilot projects working cooperatively with the BLM to try some of them. But we are delighted that the senator has been willing to consider them. And what I would like to do now is I'd like to have Jerry Franklin just talk a little about this. He is the ecologist that we strongly depend on. Please, Jerry.
Well, Norm and Jerry are kind of an interesting pair. Norm's the economist, I'm the ecologist, and we enjoy stealing a march on each other. But it's been wonderful to collaborate with the senator and his staff in working on this. And I want to point out a couple of what I consider to be really important things from an ecologist's point of view. And most fundamentally, you know, when a senator first asked us to provide some advice, some knowledge, we said, well, the first thing about a policy regarding our forest lands is you must recognize the distinction between dry forests, the frequent fire forest landscapes, and the moist forests. And that is a central element in the bill. And that's profoundly important from both an ecological and a social perspective. Second thing I want to emphasize is what the senator pointed out, which is this is the first time there's been any legislation that recognized and conserved old-growth forests. You must recognize the Northwest Forest Plan was only an action of the executive branch of government that was capable of being changed by the executive branch of government. And now we're looking at the opportunity, in fact, to conserve in a legislative fashion, a much more permanent fashion, the old-growth forests that remain here in Oregon. Finally, the last thing I want to point out is this is a courageous bill. It breaks with decades of either or. Either you must clear-cut these areas and manage them intensively for wood production, or you must preserve them. And this, in fact, rejects both of those extreme approaches and simply says, you know, yes, we're going to manage some of this for production. Yes, we are going to have wilderness and conserve the old growth, but we're going to define a new path for managing our forest resources, which in fact provides for social benefits while in fact achieving ecological goals. So that's extraordinary. It is a third path. It is a different way. And it took a lot of courage, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry.
Gordy?
Okay, the people will rule this press conference. Corey, would you like to say anything? You're welcome to.
No,
You've done
I'm
great
fine.
work.
I'm fine.
He doesn't want to say anything, actually. You ask him, he'll answer the question.
Well, that's it.
He's not going to volunteer.
You know, we asked Gordy to be involved. He is with the P&W station. And the question that I think many people would have is really what is the aquatic strategy that we are suggesting and that's in the legislation that's sort of new and different. And can you answer?
I can answer the question.
Okay.
What is your aquatic strategy? And why is it
I'm a federal employee, and I have some restrictions on me in terms of what I can say. Yeah. The aquatic conservation strategy, as articulated in this bill, is, I think, analogous to what Jerry was talking about for old growth. It's the first time we've really legislated a strong conservation policy for the aquatic. It's essentially taking the aquatic conservation strategy of the Northwest Forest Plan and implementing it in a permanent way. So again, not in its an administrative rule anymore. And what we're doing is applying it across the landscape. And the goals and objectives of the original goals and objectives of the HCS are going to be met and met permanently across that landscape. So I think from a scientific perspective, we've brought in some new science to make some, to allow for some adjustments of certain parts of it, but we kept the aquatic conservation strategy intact. And that's going to be a net plus for aquatic resources, drinking water, and others in Western Oregon. Okay.
And I'll say just one more thing, which is after these working with the senator's staff and their very interests in where backcountry would be and where wilderness would be, what sort of riparian buffers we would have, what sort of ecological forestry we'd practice on the landscape. They then I try to pull all that together and work with the BLM and their models and their data to understand what would be the, of course, implications for harvest. We did that. We did it fairly quickly, but we did that, and we did conclude that, and I concluded that, in fact, over the next 20 years, we could have at least 300 million board feet a year. A fair amount of that from the moist forests, and using some innovative harvests on the moist forest, that is the forests north of Roseburg. But that in addition, that harvest and that whole approach does provide a very strong foundation for a significant long-term sustained yield on these lands beyond 20 years. That was a very important part of this for the senator and, of course, everyone involved. We've done that work, and it is. It does involve some new harvest methods, but it was rewarding to work on to try to once again understand what can we provide from these lands in a long-term basis that would provide both the ecological benefits and the economic benefits that we all seek.
Let's go to some questions, and obviously we could not be here without Norm and Jerry, and we're so grateful. All right, David.
Senator, how is old growth defined in this bill?
We have the 120-year definition, the 150-year definition, Dick. I mean, here's the point with respect to the environmental, provisions. Oregonians have looked at this debate and said, can't we do better than permanent gridlock? That's what we've had. Oregonians want a win-win kind of approach from government. We want to put people to work, and we want to protect, our treasures. What we're doing with the current kind of approach is producing a lose-lose. We're not getting the jobs, nor are we getting the environmental protection, and that's what's important here. And as Jerry Franklin noted, this bill is the first ever to write into federal law old growth protection on the O&C lands. Yeah.
Why is this Senate bill preferable to the House bill that was passed in September? What's your position on whether a trust should actually manage the land or the feds should just be given kind of general control over that?
Yeah, that's a key question. And football analogies after what happened to the Ducks and the Beavers last weekend are sort of painful, but let me use one. You can't get into the end zone if you can't get to the 50-yard line. And you can't get to the 50-yard line on forestry policy if you can't get a bill passed by the Senate and signed into law by the President. So that is, in a sentence, what I think I'd use to kind of describe the challenge. We've already said, the governor repeated it, I've repeated it, we're going to be looking for every opportunity to find common ground with the Oregon, congressional delegation. I've already told, Chairman Hastings that I'm interested in working with him. We've worked together on a lot of matters. That helium bill that we got passed took place during the government shutdown. Nobody got a bill passed. And Chairman Hastings and I and others worked together, and now Oregon rural communities are going to be getting $100 million pretty soon, again, to try to pay for desperately needed police and roads and schools and the like. So I think the only other point I'd make is that we've been there before in terms of these approaches that employ what's essentially called sufficiency, languages, which is what you'd have with a private trust. You basically say the federal environmental laws aren't going to apply. We're going to just do everything in line with the state forest practices, law. The president has said he would veto it. I think Sid Lykin is here. Yeah, Sid is here from Lane County, a county that has a great interest in this, and Sid made the point yesterday, I thought it was very good. However you feel about the President of the United States, he will be the President of the United States until January of 2017. These rural communities are hurting now. We can't wait till 2017. So what we've got to do, and I think Sid put it more eloquently than I do, and his constituents, live and breathe it. We've got, timber leaders here from southwestern Oregon who live and breathe it. We can't afford to wait until 2017.
I guess to follow up with that, I would say is, how do you respond to some county and timber association reps who already say that you didn't include these stakeholders in the drafting process for this bill?
Well, first of all, if you just look up here, you've got basically equal representation of timber community leaders, environmental folks, people who care about clean water, people who care about, recreation. Mary Gautreaux is here. Mary, was your estimate 5,000 hours of discussion with all of the stakeholders? So we're a small state, and we spend a lot of time trying to include people, and if there's anybody you want to give me their name, I'll be reaching out to talk to them too. But that would be how I'd respond to that.
Senator, you said that you'll work to get common ground with the House leadership, but how much wiggle room do you really have? Are you saying this is about as far as you can go on the timber cut, as far as you can go in terms of what kind of legal language there is on challenging timber sales, et cetera?
Jeff, this is an approach that can work. I see this as really kicking off a new day in terms of natural resources policy in our state. We haven't had before on the O&C issue this kind of passion and commitment from a cross-section of Oregon leaders. They span political, philosophy, and I think this is an approach that can pass the Senate and actually be signed into law. Our delegation is very pragmatic. We spend a lot of time working together on various kinds of issues. So we're a pragmatic, group, and it's going to be that principle of pragmatism that we'll keep coming back to. I think a lot of what we have done here really reflects it, and I'm always interested in working with my colleagues.
But are you pretty much saying there's not a lot here because if you go much further, you're not going to have a bill that can pass the Senate to be signed into law?
A Congress that sometimes seems unable to order a Coca-Cola, let alone pass a major piece of legislation, always ought to be operating under the principle that you work with your colleagues, you try to find common ground, and as I say, on the safety net, where we got $100 million coming to rural Oregon, here in a few weeks. The House didn't have that money, Jeff. The House didn't have that money. I was able to get it in the Senate side. The House looked at it and said, we can take it if we have certain kind of considerations for our agenda. That's what legislating is all about. There have been two major forest laws written in the last 20 years. And I have been involved in engineering both of them. One's the Secure Rural Schools Bill, which has brought the timber payments law, which has brought our state about $2.6 billion. That was before the helium money. The second was the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which took place during the Bush administration. It got out of the House. It couldn't get passed in the Senate. The Bush administration asked me to work with them to rewrite the bill. We got 80 votes on it. I have written timber legislation that becomes law. I'm going to work with my colleagues to do that again.
Senator, how many jobs are we talking, and how do you really expect this to transform the economies of these really rural communities?
Well, I'll let some of our timber leaders maybe chime in on this, but what they've told me is the two operative words for them in terms of investment in forestry are certainty and predictability. And maybe I'll take those, the second one first. You get the predictability when you look at that letter that we got from the Bureau of Land Management. And by the way, no other such letter exists. You're going to be hearing numbers thrown around for bills, and they're going to create such and such harvest. This is the only letter that actually has at the top of the page a header from a government agency with jurisdiction. And they have validated essentially our effort to average for the next 20 years, average for the next 20 years between 300 and 350 million board feet. That doubles the average cut, folks, for the last decade. For the last decade, the cut was well under 150 million board feet. This will double it for the next 20 years. That, and I'll let the private industry folks talk about it, ensures some predictability that, of course, is key for the private sector. The other determination that they told me that was key for their investments is having certainty. And so what we do is we essentially stack everything to the front end. You basically get one bite at the apple. There's an environmental impact statement for the dry forest, an environmental impact statement for the wet forests. Everybody comes to the table. In other words, there's no exclusion. The timber people sit next to the environmental people, sit next to the clean water people. Everybody comes to the table over a short time window, and that basically drives the next 10 years unless there are exceptional circumstances. So if any timber executive would like to, add anything, I'd be happy to let them. But what I've heard from the industry is that they want more than anything else some certainty and some predictability with respect to where the harvest is going. That's what we've delivered in the bill.
We got time for one more question.
Does any industry person want to say anything? Alan, go.
Well, I'll say very briefly, this question of certainty, you look at the rural communities in which we live in, and some of us are landowners and we are manufacturers. And we invest in people and training, we invest in plants and machinery and equipment to produce the products we do make. And to make that kind of investment, we need that predictability, we need that future. And I'll add the word sustainability, which, from the conservation community is something we both treasure. But we're looking for that conservation piece, that sustainability, as it relates to jobs and people in our rural communities. And I think obviously in responding to the senator and to the governor, the concept this is a certainty thing for our people. It's a question about jobs.
And I want to close this off. I'm going to stick around with a little tip of the hat with what you just heard. You heard a timber industry leader from Southern Oregon who has been committed to his communities for years make the last word that what he was concerned about as a timber industry leader was sustainability and conservation. That's the Oregon way, folks. That's what Oregon is all about, where timber industry folks reach out to conservationists and environmentalists and say we're going to find common ground, and you get conservation folks going back the other way. Thanks for having us.
Governor, can we ask you a couple questions on a side note about Cover Oregon?
You can ask one, so roll it all into one.
Several more security breaches we've found out about. What are your thoughts? There are 3 now. How do you go about fixing this to make sure this won't happen, and does this set us further behind on the timetable?
No, we're still planning to ensure that everyone who is seeking enrollment by January 1st gets enrollment. We have 30,000 applications. We are processing. Out of those, there were 3 of these security breaches, which is 3 too many. Friday, we fundamentally changed that process. We've put Bruce Goldberg exclusively in charge of managing the paper application process. He has authority over both resources and personnel at Oregon Health Authority and Cover Oregon. So I believe we've taken care of that problem, and we will continue to ensure that we meet our deadlines. After all, the objective here is not the website, it's enrollment. We will get the website up, but we're not waiting for that to make sure people get coverage.
And what insurances do you have for our buildings?
One.
Yes.